All right, Vance, can you hear me over here?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So today our guest speaker is Vance Crowe. He's the Director of Millennial Engagement for Bayer now, since Monsanto is now part of Bayer. I think Vance has had a lot of interesting interactions and experiences, and he's still a pretty young guy. And he's going to share some of those to us through his some of the stuff he's learned over the years with storytelling. Storytelling has become big in video production in general. Even when I was in my grad program, they were talking about it. And this idea of storytelling to make it more interesting. And we're not just making a video that has information. These aren't just informational videos. We have to somehow find how can we make this interesting and appealing to our target audiences. Okay? So this video is, before I say this, yeah. So we're recording this. I'm gonna. This video is recorded, so you'll have everything that's said here today. However, you all have your notebooks out, and I would capture anything that's either not on the slides that's being said. That way you can make sure you capture some of those. But you'll have the opportunity, and I'll post this on our YouTube site for the course, so you can always go back and review it. All right, without further ado, Vance, it's all you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Leal. You know, I was caught off guard by the fact that some of your students had actually been there last year. How many of you saw me come down to your university last year? Oh man, okay. So I hope I don't repeat myself, or if I do, I'm going to say it with enough gusto that'll make it sound like it's new or different. But as Dr. Leal said, my name is Vance Crowe, and I am the curiously titled Director of Millennial Engagement for what was formerly Monsanto and is now Bayer. And that job has been a rather interesting one, and it really has to do almost entirely with storytelling, because I entered the company at a time when they decided people have become so concerned about where their food is coming from, and they've been made to feel afraid and even angry about it, to the extent that they go out and actions manifest in the real world because people have heard stories about how dark and terrible either the company is or some of the technologies they have. So about 5 years ago, the company said, we're going to completely reorganize. And even though we sell almost nothing at all to consumers, what we're going to do is we're going to try and set up a new way to think about how do we engage with consumers. And they did all of the standard things that you would imagine, setting up, hiring a PR firm and doing focus groups and getting a web team that puts out blogs and monitors social media. And then they also built another team that was entirely designed on getting out into the public. Just go out and try and figure out what are the questions that consumers have, where should we be going in order to be able to find out those questions, and then try and address them as best you can. And when you can't address them, come back and tell the company that you've heard things that they have concerns about that we really should be addressing. And so I took that job, but it was not obvious actually that I would have been the right person for this job, because in actuality, when I came to interview for the position, it was my understanding that the company was probably a pretty dark place. I had heard all of the stories and all of the negativity that everybody else had. So I had really only taken the job interview because I wanted to see inside of Willy Wonka's chocolate factory. But when I saw what the opportunity was really about, and what they were offering me, essentially this job, as I went through the interview process, I realized that they were going to let me run around the company and try and figure out, are they as dark and evil, and are these technologies as bad as everybody says that they are? If they are, then I'm going to go write the greatest tell-all book of all time. Or if they're not, then you've just discovered one of the most important communications problems maybe in the history of civilization, which is we're growing food more bountifully than we ever have before in the history of time, and yet people are afraid and even angry about where their food comes from. And so I took that opportunity and have been doing this job for almost the last 5 years. and it's provided a very interesting insight into the world. But I thought that for this presentation, what I could do was to try and help you come up with some different ways to think about storytelling. And the reason that I think that it's so important is, how many of you right now are in agriculture? You came from farming families, or so many of you then that are raising your hands, if you've been to any kind of conferences, you constantly hear people saying, farmers, you need to tell your story. You need to tell your story, which I think is actually probably true. But the problem is that no one is telling anyone like what makes a good story, right? How, if I'm going to tell my story, why should I do it? What should I do it? And so that video that I had Dr. Leal share with you all was trying to show that oftentimes when you're telling a story, you need to think about the hero in a very different way than the farmer is the hero. And so I want to talk and break down a little bit of these concepts of storytelling that we've picked up. And hopefully this will have an impact on some of the videos that you guys are being asked to do for the end of the session. And I think that maybe before I get started, I wanted to tell a story. I'm not sure if I told it the last time I was with you guys, but it's one that's pretty important to me, is the story of when I was living in Kenya. So really, it's really the story of how I figured out storytelling was so important. So when I finished college, I don't know about all of you, but when I finished college, I had no idea at all what I wanted to be when I grew up. And so this meant that when I left school, I just started searching for what I could do. I ended up running a camp for inner city kids. I became a deckhand on a ship. And eventually I found myself joining the US Peace Corps. And when I joined the Peace Corps, I ended up going to this really small remote village in the mountains. And this remote village had initially brought me in to do water sanitation projects, like helping people figure out where are we going to dig our latrines and how are we going to harvest rainwater so that our village can have better drinking water. But as I was there for a little while, I figured out, wait a second, actually this village has a new problem that they've never really had before, and it's really serious. And that problem was that malaria had come to this town. And the reason that it had come to this town was because in the past, this mountain village had been too far up in the mountains that if somebody got sick down in the valley where there were more mosquitoes that were carrying that disease, then by the time they tried to get up to the village, they were way too sick to be able to get all the way up to the top. But because of some modernity, people had built a road, and there was a lot more ability to hop on a bus or a small van and be able to get up into the village. And so people started bringing malaria into this village, and it started killing some of their young children, or making some of the adults really, really sick in a way that hadn't before. So my job was then changed to be like, I'm going to teach people how to prevent malaria. And so every day I would go down to the village square in the center of town, and I would teach them, this is what causes malaria. It's the female Anopheles mosquito, and it only comes out between the hours of 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. So if you can keep your children covered at night with long sleeves, or if you can put bed nets on and treat them with this insecticide correctly, or if you can go and get rid of all the puddles of water that are around, you can prevent malaria. And, you know, as I was doing this work, I really felt, maybe for the first time in all of that searching that I'd been doing to try and find a good job for myself, I felt like, finally, I have found a job where I am doing good. And I knew that I was doing good because I was teaching science, and that science was going to help prevent people from getting malaria. And so I had this great sense of pride and satisfaction in what I was doing, until one day a man came walking into town. And this man was, he was wearing a crisp suit, and it was brown. It was pressed really, really well. And he, which it isn't uncommon for men when traveling in Africa to be wearing suits, but this was really clean and very well pressed. So something was a little bit different about him. And he was carrying a box about this big. And so he comes walking into the village right at the same place that I generally did my lessons on malaria. And he sets that box down, and he steps up on top of it, and he says, "My brothers and sisters, bow your heads and pray." And so everybody in that little area that's normally doing their market, they're buying their vegetables and just kind of talking about the news of the day, they stop what they're doing, and they put their heads down and they start praying. And so he goes through this prayer, And then as soon as he's done, he pops his head back up and he says, "My brothers and sisters, I am here because I have heard a terrible tragedy is happening here. I have heard that the scourge of malaria has found its way to this town." And so now he has everybody's attention because he's right. You know, they're all paying attention to this, and they were not. They were used to hearing me talk about it in the center of the town. So they start gathering around him in a way that they never gathered around me because he had so much emphasis. And so then he says, my brothers and sisters, I'm here because I know about how terrible malaria is. You see, when a few years ago, my wife and my daughter were killed by this terrible disease, and it destroyed my life, my brothers and sisters. And so once that happened, I sold my shamba, my garden and my farm and my home, and I left my village, and I went searching everywhere that I could to find what could have kept them from dying from malaria. And I passed over mountains, and I crossed through rivers, and I traveled and looked and searched everywhere that I could until one day I came upon a man by a brook, and this man was a monk. And he looked deep into my eyes, and he saw how much pain I was in and how far I had traveled. And so he took water from that brook, water that I have right here. And he pulled out this little vial out of his pocket, and he says, if I had only had this water that was from that brook, I could have poured that into the wash basin of my family. We could have washed ourselves with that water, and we would not have gotten malaria, and my wife and daughter would not be dead right now. And so I'm watching this go on, and really picture yourself if you were there. You're seeing this happen, and everybody is surrounding him on this box. And in my mind, I am sitting there laughing because I think to myself, buddy, you came to the wrong town because I brought science here, and I've been teaching these people. And I was quite confident that nothing was going to happen. But when he asked those people for 500 Kenyan shillings, which is the equivalent of 2 full days of backbreaking work in equatorial Africa for little vials of water, every single one of them found a way to give him that money to buy those little vials. And I sat there wondering, what is it that I should do? Should I go knock him off of his box? Should I go try and jump in front of them and say, no, this is a lie. There's no possible way that this is correct. Remember, I've been teaching you the science. But I didn't do anything at all. In fact, I watched him sell these vials of water, take his pockets of money, step down off of his box, pick it up, and walk on, probably to the next village. And I would say that that moment was probably the lowest point of my entire life, or at least up to that point. And I went home that night, and I had the staggering realization that the science is not enough. That in fact, all the things that we do in life, the actions that we take, are all dependent on the stories that we tell ourselves. And that man walked into that town, and he had a better story than I did. And he was able to sell them something that wouldn't help them. And so that the science isn't enough. You have to do things with stories. And really, when I had the opportunity to come to Monsanto, I realized this might be my chance to compete against the man on the box that is in other domains. And so it is something that is deeply in me to try and help people that understand how modern agriculture, how modern science works, to be able to tell better stories. And I think that that is essential in what you're doing here. This practice that you have to be able to create a promotional video for your college is a great chance for you to figure out and take a chance on telling a story when the stakes aren't so high. So I'm going to take the rest of the time and convert this into maybe more of a standard lecture. So why are almost all promotional videos boring? If I were to ask you guys that, what would you say? Who has some ideas on why most promotional videos are boring? Yep.
Because it's kind of like going to class, and if somebody's not interested in what the teacher's saying, then you're not going to pay attention.
Okay, because they're boring?
Like if you're not already invested in it, and it doesn't just catch you automatically, then you're just going to keep clicking on because you don't want to sit there and waste the time.
Waste the time, right? And you could be watching anything you want. So why, if you're on the internet, so why watch a promotional video that's boring? Any other ideas?
it's not compelling. It's there's no story, but it's laid out in a very structured way, and that the information has to be gotten across without really a whole lot of fluff.
Yeah, I mean, the formulaic thing, when I go to different conferences all the time, you can tell whatever company is there, it's almost like filling in a Mad Lib. This was our product and we want to talk about this and this is why it's great. So it's very formulaic and kind of predictable, right? Any other reasons? Well, clearly, since this is a lecture on storytelling, the punchline is that I don't think they have very good stories, but there's something more there. So I want to talk about why is it that we care about stories? And just like you heard in that video by Jonah Sachs, we listen to stories because it helps us understand ourselves in a better and a deeper way. Now, there's something funny about that Jonah Sachs. Did any of you guys go and look up any of the history behind who Jonah Sachs actually is? Anybody? So he is a very interesting character, and it's actually quite odd that I, of all people, would share that with him. He is actually a consultant for activist groups that are very strongly opposed to modern agriculture. So he does stuff for the Humane Society of the U.S. He's done work, I believe, with PETA. He's done the Story of Stuff. His work is actually a lot of the storytelling work that has been used to make people afraid of modern agriculture. And so it's kind of interesting that he would be a person that I would share that with, but I can tell you that he is extraordinarily good at tapping into the hero's journey. The reason that we listen to stories is because those stories, we watch somebody else go through a story that we're interested in because we want to know, what can I learn from this? How can I get something away from it that helps me understand myself? And so when we think about the different parts of a story, you guys, I'm sure, are very familiar with the fact that there are heroes and villains. And the stories that we care the most about is the ones when we say, not only what does the hero want, but why do they want it? So let's play a little bit of a game here. What are some of your favorite movies you've ever seen, or favorite stories that all of us would be familiar with?
Star Wars, pretty good.
Star Wars? Okay, so who's the lead character in Star Wars? Well, I guess it kind of depends on which one you're talking about.
Say Luke Skywalker, Anakin Skywalker.
Okay, and what did they want? What did Luke Skywalker want?
He was trying to figure out how to defeat the evil side of the Force. His dad.
And what did you come to find out about why he wanted that?
It was kind of like predestined kind of a deal, but it's like he understood why the dark side was bad, and he understood that there's good things, like there's positive benefits to being good, and he wanted to try to stop that evil. Okay, so he wanted to stop something. And what are other stories that you guys really like?
Fight Club.
Fight Club, okay. So what did the main character want in Fight Club?
Depends on which perspective. You're talking about the narrator, or are you talking about Tyler Durden?
Either one. I mean, probably the narrator. What did the narrator want?
Just a sense of belonging.
He wanted a sense of belonging, and why?
Because they knew there was a void in his life, and he couldn't fill it with just those meetings that he went to.
Yeah, and so you're seeing this world of everything being generic, and you can see that that he wants to have something more authentic, more real. So he wants it. He wants to have a sense of belonging. He wants to escape from this sense of generic. Any other stories? I mean, this is actually probably the easiest question you will be asked all day. What is a favorite movie or story of yours?
Magnificent Seven.
I'm sorry?
The Magnificent Seven.
The Magnificent Seven. So this is actually a movie I've never seen before. What do they want?
Well, it's really like a band of guys from different backgrounds and different stories coming together to help this little town kind of overcome their oppressors. So it's like this like mining town is being oppressed by this dude that's like really greedy for gold and whatnot, and he sends like all his lackeys into the town to like force them to work for like absolutely no money. And these 7 come in and basically orchestrate an overthrow of the bad guy, basically.
Okay.
And they, argue that they're all just adversaries, just in it for the money, but at the same time, they're still doing something good, quote unquote.
And why did they want to do it for good?
Because I think they really all had backgrounds that kind of told that they could kind of relate to the stories of the people in the town. Like they had been pushed around, they had been, knocked down, and they hated to see other people knocked down by this, by this big guy picking on the little guy.
Okay, that seems like one that we can all relate to. So I have spent quite a bit of time reading screenwriters and talking, actually going to lectures on what makes great screenplays. And there's a man named Eric Edson, and you guys might find him very interesting to look up as you're creating your promotional videos. I'll have a link to it at the end of this presentation. But he said something to me that was, I thought, incredible. And I've tried to test this as best I can, and as best as I can tell, he's completely right. And it is that he says, in every single story that you have ever seen that you love, they all come down to the hero has one of 4 goals, external goals. And there are only these 4 goals, and all the stories you've ever heard use one of these 4 and then wrap everything else around it. And what he says these 4 goals are is that the hero needs to either win, stop, retrieve, or escape. And it's that larger goal that the hero is going for that everyone can relate to. So if you think about the Magnificent Seven, you were saying he wants to stop that, right? They want to stop the people in the town. Or if you think about a movie like Indiana Jones, right? He wants to go in and get the treasure and get out. Or we could think about some other movies and some different categories. So I want to take just a few minutes and think about, for each one of these categories, can you think of an example of a story where that's really what was going on? The goal of the hero was to win, stop, retrieve, or escape. Who can think of one for win?
Rocky.
Rocky, there you go. And so why did Rocky want to win?
Depends on which movie you're talking about. I think just because he, for the first one, for example, just kind of to the second one, to kind of avenge the death of his friend Apollo, and to just send a message.
Right. Or even in the first one, it was just to prove to himself that he wasn't just a guy from the gutter, that he was worth something more, right? Does anybody have an example of a story where stop is the thing that they're trying to do rather than other than the examples we already used?
Harry Potter.
Harry Potter. Okay. What does Harry Potter want to stop?
Voldemort.
And why does he want to do that?
Because the evil magic basically can take over, and that's not good.
Okay. And he felt called to do this because it was something in him, right?
Yep.
I think Harry Potter is amazing, and it will have profound implications on the entire generation, from mine all the way through to yours, because everybody watched, it's like 7 volumes, right? We're all inducted into this very, very complicated cult that has rules and a world and everything that's in it. I think Harry Potter is a really good example for stop. Can anybody think of one for retrieve?
National Treasure movies.
National Treasure. Okay, so what do they want to retrieve?
Depends on which one, but it was either the Declaration of Independence or just like the national or international treasures.
And why did they want to retrieve it?
To kind of just prove the existence of these treasures and the historical prominence of those treasures.
And then if you think about it, and I don't remember that's a Nicolas Cage movie, right? The National Treasure. So I think that like when you go back and watch those, you can figure out that there's some intrinsic thing. Like the example that I use for retrieve often is Indiana Jones. And the fascinating thing about Indiana Jones is it isn't until you get to the third one, the Temple of Doom, that you find out that he's actually trying to live up to his father's expectations of him. So he wants to go in and retrieve all these things because he feels like his father doesn't respect him and he wants to get his father's respect. And that creates this like very profound sense of, oh, now I understand why he wants to do that, because that's oftentimes a really human emotion. There are oftentimes children want to prove something to their fathers or to their mothers. And so the why behind the retrieve is something deeper. Can anybody think of an escape example?
Bird Box.
I didn't hear that. What was that?
Bird Box.
I don't even know.
Sandra Bullock
What?
movie.
Tell me about.
It's a Netflix movie.
Okay, so tell me about it.
All right, well, it's an invisible monster, right? And they're trying to get away from it because if you look at it, it makes you kill yourself. And they were hiding in a house for like 5 years, and they had 2 kids. And then they go to another house to get food, and then the step-in husband gets killed. And then they go to a blind. It's like a house for blind people, and they get there and have to like escape the monster.
Okay, Bird Box. I see. Yes, I've seen a lot about this. Okay. And so, but at the core, the hero of the story, is that Sandra Bullock?
Yeah.
What motivates her? Why does she want to escape this?
The kids.
Her love for her children. So the thing that I'm trying to point out here is, it's on the one hand, all of your stories can use this. You can say, hey, this is what the end goal that everybody understands that the hero is going for. But the way that you will make people love your story, the way that you will make them be completely attached to it, is if you can say, why is it that the person wants to do this? What is the thing that makes them drive through to try and achieve this goal? And so when we think about that goal, right, it's the goal becomes far more interesting if the opponent is formidable. And so, in a promotional video, you are going to have to be creative because it's likely that you're not going to be able to have a Voldemort where you're saying this evil being is going to try and take over the world, or, there's not some monster coming after you, but you could do it metaphorically. You could do it in a variety of different ways. But the thing that's really interesting about villains that most of the time people don't understand is that if you make your villain just pure evil, they are evil for the sake of being evil, that's not that interesting because people don't believe in it, right? It's like, okay, evil, the twirling mustache, super villain is not actually all that interesting. What's really interesting is when you take a villain and they have their own motivation. It's just that their motivation has prompted them to do things that we would not agree with, right? So that's that tension between the hero trying to get what they want and the villain trying to get what they want is what makes that story so interesting. And when you're thinking about how you create the story for your promotional video, if you're going to try and do it as a story, you're going to need to think of what is something that will block the hero from getting the thing it is that they want. And what is it, and make that so difficult that their why for how they get over that hump is big enough and believable enough to see it through, to have people be interested to see, will they make it? Does that make sense? Can you guys think of interesting villains that you really like from other movies you've seen before?
Thanos from the Avengers
So is
movie.
that's an Avengers movie? Okay, yeah. He is though like all super powerful, isn't he?
Yeah, but his motivations were to try to destroy half the universe in order to try to stop the use of resources so that the people who do live get to live prosperously.
There you go. Okay.
His planet was used up of all its resources.
That's interesting. Okay. And can you guys think of another villain?
I say Voldemort.
Voldemort? Okay. Clearly you guys like Harry Potter. And what did Voldemort want?
He wanted to be the most powerful wizard because Dumbledore was the guy who was kind of his mentor whenever he was younger, but you didn't find that out until the end. And so, like, the whole time I feel like he was trying to live up to Dumbledore's like potential, because Dumbledore was considered like the best, most powerful wizard, but he was a wizard that was for good, and Voldemort was evil.
Interesting. Are there other villains that you guys can think of that you like, or that you find at least really, really compelling?
The Joker.
The Joker. The Joker is really an interesting one. What did the Joker want?
The Joker, it's really, I'm thinking of the Dark Knight kind of Joker. It's almost like he wanted a new world order. It's like he didn't really see things the way that most people saw them. Like, I can remember one line when he said the only sensible way to live on this earth is without rules. So he basically wanted to send a message that all of our rules and regulations and laws, they're all corrupt in their own sort of way. And so the only way to alleviate that is to live without them or break them.
That's a great one, right? So he wanted to prove that the way that he felt like the chaos of his own mind was exactly the same with everybody else. And he was willing to go to great lengths to prove that. And he became a formidable opponent because the Batman had all these rules. He's lawful good, and he was coming up against this chaotic evil. And so it was the perfect balance between, a person that's super disciplined and another one that is just trying to break everything. He's willing to break the good guys, but he's also willing to break the bad guys. Clearly, this is a story. That's one of actually my all-time favorite movies. So you chose one of my favorites. Okay, so we're gonna keep going. So the interesting thing, if you watched that video by Jonah Sachs about the hero and their journey, the key to making people truly connect with your story is that the achievement of the goal requires the hero to change in some way. Because if you have a hero in the story that already has all of the capabilities it needs to be able to overcome the villain, then that's not a story, right? What you need is a person that has some characteristics and some desires and some motivations to try and achieve a goal, but they don't have something. They need to learn something or change in some way. And because if you don't, then you have this very one-dimensional character. But the heroes that change are the ones that like teach us something about ourselves. What is it that we need to change about ourselves? Can you think of a moment of change in a movie that you found interesting, where you're like, oh, okay, that was the change moment that the hero had to go through? You could even do Harry Potter if there's some big Harry Potter fans. Any thoughts at all?
Well, I think whenever it was revealed in Star Wars when Luke, his father was Anakin Skywalker, who is Darth Vader, I think that challenged Luke in an ethical and moral way to say that it made him change and view the outlook of the different sides of the Force differently.
Okay. And he did, and then he had to have a more nuanced understanding of the world around him rather than just good and bad.
Right.
Other stories? What was the moment of change in Bird Box? And I don't mind if we have a spoiler. What did she have to change about herself in order to be able to achieve the goal?
She had to learn how to love.
She had to learn how to love.
Yeah, at first she hated the idea of having a kid. So the fact that she was able to not only have her own kid, but then also take care of the other girl's kid, and it kind of changed her in a way.
Okay, that's interesting.
Left him, but she took care of him the whole time.
What change did Harry have to go through?
I think there again, it's another nuanced understanding of good and evil, and kind of the decisions that were made, some of the decisions that were made on the side of good necessarily weren't the best decisions made, but he had to have a full understanding of the scope of the situation in order to be able to have that full understanding of where Voldemort was coming from and where Dumbledore was coming from.
I think that one of the unsung parts of Harry Potter is the continual change of Neville, who was clearly like the nerdy guy that really, you wouldn't expect him to, go forward, but like his acceptance that it was friendships and who you care about that makes you strong enough to be able to do bigger things. So anyway, that's an interesting component to try and think about. What kind of change do you want your person, the hero of your story, to go through, and how can you set up that climax so that as they try and get to their goal and something stands in their way, what did they have to change in order to be able to achieve their goal? So as we think about this, and I'm going to wrap up, I'll have one more slide to tell you some people that I think might help you as you guys get confused, because you're going to try and do something really difficult here, which is take a normal promotional video that could have just been like, hey, I'm going to take pretty shots, or I'm going to get some drone footage, or I'm going to have some cool music in here. And now you're going to try and tell an actual story. It is a lot harder to do this. But the reason that it's worth it to do it is if you can figure out how to give your promotional video in a story, it will make it much more powerful. People will have a reason to share it and show it to other people. And you'll be able to transfer that to other stories that you want to tell at other times, whether that's throughout the rest of your college career or even into your professional careers. Because I can tell you, there are not that many great storytellers, particularly in agriculture, doing it on this level of making video. So as we finish up, what can you think back on that you'll use to apply to your promotional videos? Let's try and come up with a few things that you're going to think about differently now that we've talked about storytelling.
I think the one of the ways that we'd be able to do that is because, like earlier you said, the best way to make a villain more memorable is to have like the goals relatable. I feel like if it is taking the enemy and like the enemy being like hunger, or like the enemy being the fact that like the growing population is going to make it to the point where it's going to be hard for us to be able to produce enough food as it is. Like some people know about it, but like I feel like we take for granted the knowledge that the ordinary people have about that. I feel like telling that story more and showing what it truly means to be like to be food insecure, or to showing what it's really like to not know where your next meal is going to come from, and try to relate that back to the purpose of agriculture and the purpose of growing food. I think that would be a good way to do it.
Okay, so you're saying, hey, I'm going to put forward a different type of villain and try and make it so that if we make people interested enough in this, they're going to want to see what our school has to offer. What other ways can you do this? What other things will you apply?
Something that would be powerful would be to whoever the students are that we're interviewing for their specific department, maybe like delving into their story and finding out something that they overcame in college, and kind of highlighting that to make it a more relatable video.
Okay, so what challenges do people overcome that they didn't even know that they had? Others? Yeah, go ahead.
So I want y'all to think a little bit like this, definitely with the major videos, but a lot of what I told you last class period, what I think now through this lecture is that, what about our in the day of the life videos? You're going to have one person you're going to focus on. That means you're going to have to find some villain, some obstacle, something that they're going through just being a student in their major, in their department, but also a student on this campus, right? Because one of my questions for you, Vance, was, does a villain necessarily have to be a person? Can a villain be an idea? Can a villain be, like if we were to create a promotional video for this college, one of the biggest villains we have with recruitment is what? Money. Besides money. And when we have competition, what's another villain we have?
I would just say misconception about ag.
Some misconception about ag. What about our size? I think every time I go to these things, they're like, no, but I'm thinking about our target students. the first thing I hear is
That's what drew me here.
UT Martin's so much smaller, and I think UT's too big. And I'm really intimidated going to my small city or my small town and coming to a university that's so big, and then I'm going to get lost. And so one of my things I've always thought of is one of our biggest villains, aside from the things you're saying, and I agree, is that our size intimidates the people coming in.
I mean, that sounds awesome, right? So if you think about how to, you may have to turn it into something that you anthropomorphize. It's a mountain that somebody's trying to get over, right? Like, not all villains are actual people. They can be, nature, and they can be things that are maybe more esoteric. So it could be things like time or space, or, like you said, confronting your fear of being lost or not being a valued member of a community. All of those things you can juxtapose that character in and show in the day in the life, how did they overcome it? Any other ideas? I don't know that I've heard, other than the Harry Potter comment, any of the women in the class speak. What other ways do you think you will apply this in your promotional videos, particularly the day in the life one, which I think is that's a really fun challenge.
I think that being able to capture a day in the life of a student here at the Ag College kind of puts into perspective for potential students what it's actually like to be a student here. They come to all of the orientations and they read bulletins and they can find all this information about the college, but actually looking and seeing what it's like to be here, to study here, and just all of the things that go on here, I think them being able to see from our perspective what it's actually like to be here and go here it's going to be more compelling for them than just, sending them out brochures and emails and packets and flyers and all that kind of traditional recruitment type information.
Yeah, agreed. And then trying to figure out a way to tell it to them in a way that they can see themselves as a part of that story. I agree. So I'm going to finish up, and then we can do any kind of questions or anything that you want. But this right here, from all of my hours and hours, unimaginable amounts of time I've spent studying storytelling, these are places that I think you guys can go to that you'll find very interesting. So you already heard the future of storytelling. But if you want to hear about from who I think is one of the best screenwriters, Eric Edson, he has a YouTube channel, where there is a YouTube channel called Film Courage, where they interview him several times. And that's an exceptional one. In fact, all of those screenwriters are there. So when you're sitting around being like, I don't know how I'm going to do this, I would suggest going onto that channel and just watching a few of those videos. And Dr. Leal has this slide deck, so he can actually give you the links. Another interesting one, so you guys already watched The Future of Storytelling, but there is a guy out of New York City. His name is Patrick H. Willems, and Patrick is a very interesting guy. He got denied from film school something like 2 or 3 times. And so what he decided to do was to say, well, forget him. I don't need those guys for film school. I'm going to start making my own YouTube videos. And a lot of them are film criticisms. And what he does is he goes through and he breaks down different scripts and how they work. But the one that I have here is one that I would highly recommend you guys go watch, because it could impact how you think about making your day in the life videos. And it is how to make the perfect action scene. And it's really, how do you make a chase scene that people really, really want to watch? And he does it by going through the claymation Wallace and Gromit and showing the chase scene that they have with the penguin. And it is really extraordinary. And I think that it might help you guys think about creative ways. So sometimes when you start talking about, I want you to do storytelling for this promotional video, it can become a little overwhelming. And you can see through the way that Patrick does his videos that you don't necessarily have to follow the standard rules. And I think that you guys might like this. And then if you guys really want to do some deep dive, Jonah Sachs actually wrote a book called Winning the Story Wars, which is a much more high fidelity view of what he had in that book. And then if you ever want to know the actual, like, the the key person that came up with the concept of the hero's journey is a man named Joseph Campbell, and he wrote a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he talks about all of the ways that you can tell heroes' journeys stories, and that's truly exceptional. And if you don't want to read the whole book, there are infinite number of YouTube videos about that concept, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, with Joseph Campbell. So that was the what I had prepared for class today, and we can use whatever remaining time you want for questions or trying to figure out how you're going to do your day in the life videos.
I got a question.
Sure.
Vance, when you're championing a company like Monsanto or now Bayer, you're obviously you've already been villainized to a point. So where do you go when trying to create that villain and championing that cause of science? Where do you go? Like, how do you go about that?
So, one of the interesting things, and I'm actually now feeling the pressure of it, when I was working on behalf of Monsanto, one of the best things about that was there is a really easy story that can be told in, I thought this person was the villain, and now I see that they're not. Now, they didn't necessarily have to view Monsanto as the hero, but it is an entire story that kind of writes itself when you say, everybody that was coming to this scenario assumed that we were the dark villain. And now, because I've heard these stories, I see them in a different light. And that's a story that tells itself. I find it actually much more difficult to be compelling when you're Bayer, when people are like, that's the aspirin company that you're now working for farming. So that becomes much more difficult to be able to find those things to talk about. But what I often do is people come to their understanding about modern agriculture by looking at one really small thing. And I often try and widen out the camera lens. So to talk about things in a bigger way and tell stories within that wider lens. And so, for example, the other day I was giving a presentation to some of the biggest farmers in the United States. And we were talking about, do you guys know what percentage of the population farmers are in the United States?
2.2.
You guys are saying about 2%. It's about 1.6% now, depending on who you ask. So in 1900, it was actually 42% of the population. So you actually watch that line. If you go chart it from 1900 down to 2017, the line goes like this. There's an interesting thing that's just happened. In 1997, 42% of the world's population lived and worked on farms. And 20 years later, in 2017, that number fell from 42% to 26%. So that huge drop that's just happened represents hundreds of millions of people that were working for generations and generations on the farm and are now moving into cities. And that same drop, when you were looking at the US, it took 35 years for that drop to happen. And around the world, now just in the last 20 years, they've made it an even bigger drop. And so when you start doing that, then you can pick out the person that is moving in the modern age in 2019 from living on a farm in a rural agrarian lifestyle to now being in an urban environment. And what are they seeing and what will their children understand about farming? So you have to find different ways to be able to tell those stories. And I do it by widening it out. So that's a very long answer to, I guess, kind of a short question, but widening the camera lens out on facts that people think they already know.